think it's important for Alaskans to know the long history of Filipinos in the state, the large presence of Filipinos in the state today, and the significant contributions of Filipinos to the state in various sectors, in various industries. It's important for Alaskans, all Alaskans, to know that, because Filipino Alaskan history is Alaskan history.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, in honor of Filipino American History Month, our guests are two professors from the University of Alaska Anchorage, Drs. EJ David and Gabriel Garcia. This past session, HB 23, sponsored by Representative Genevieve Mina, passed the Alaska legislature unanimously and was signed into law by Governor Dunleavy. This bill makes October Filipino American History Month. So today we will be talking about Filipinos in Alaska. Our guests are both PhDs, both born in the Philippines, both migrated to Alaska as children. The first, Dr. Gabriel Garcia, is a professor of public health at the University of Alaska Anchorage and is the coordinator of UAA's Master of Public Health program. His research has highlighted health disparities in Filipino fish processing plant workers, and we will be talking about his current research regarding the potential resiliency that can be gained from ethnic studies programs.
Dr. Gabriel Garcia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You were born in the Philippines?
Yes, I was born in the Philippines and migrated to Anchorage, Alaska in 1987.
Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and how you ended up in Alaska?
Sure. It's actually an interesting story. My dad's sister, back in the early 60s, this was an all-female band, and they traveled everywhere in the world, and she met her husband here in Alaska. So they started a family here, petitioned my grandparents, and my grandparents petitioned my dad and my family. And so we migrated here in 1987. At that point, I started my middle school.
And you graduated from high school?
I did.
Anchorage.
Yes, I graduated over Diamond High School in 1993.
The reason why we're having this interview is it's Filipino American History Month. Representative Genevieve Mina recommended you for the podcast. I wanted to talk a little bit about Filipino American History Month. How much do you know about Filipinos in Alaska?
When I first migrated here as a middle school student, I didn't know much about, actually, I didn't know anything at all about Filipino American history. My first knowledge and exposure to Filipino American history was in college. I went to UC Davis, and that's when I had an opportunity to take a Filipino American course. And that opened my mind and helped me learn about Filipino American history. So I'm by no means any expert in Filipino American history, but I learned to appreciate it and really learn about it from that experience. So that's how it all started for me. It all started back in college. The earliest Filipinos arrived here in Alaska, specifically around 1788, but a lot more arrived early 1900s. And these are Filipino migrant workers that came from places like California and also Hawaii, the sugar plantations there. But in California, they have the fields there where there's vegetables. Some of the migrant workers work there, but during the season, they would go up to Alaska to work in fish processing plants. This goes way back in the 1900s. It's a job opportunity for many Filipinos. And fast forward to this current time, we still have several Filipinos, a lot of Filipinos working in fish processing because it's a good opportunity for them to earn money, make a living, and be able to have enough to send to their families, whether in the Philippines or their family in the lower 48. It's attractive for many of them, and I'm referring to the research that I've done in Dutch Harbor, because they get to stay in one place. They don't have to go outside. Their housing is provided for them. Food is provided for them. And so the money that they earn from in the working fish processing plants goes towards what their needs are and also to provide for their family.
Can you tell us the story? You said it was your uncle who came to Alaska
My
first?
aunt.
Your aunt. Can you tell us that story about how she got here and why she made the decision? And then why your family in particular chose to leave the Philippines?
Yeah, I don't have the full story of my aunt, my dad's sister. But like I said, when she was young, probably in her teenage years, she was in an all-female band. They were called the Powlettes. She still lives here in Anchorage, Alaska. And like I said, they traveled all over the world doing concerts. And she ended up here in Alaska doing concerts and met her husband. And she knows that her family will have better opportunities here in the U.S. And she petitioned my grandparents.
And did your grandparents want to come? Were they excited to come?
That one, I wouldn't know, but I would assume that they were excited to come here because their daughter is here. And that...
So it wasn't about escaping poverty or anything like that?
Yeah, I don't think it was about escaping poverty at that point. I think it's more of opportunities for their family. Their middle income family back in the Philippines, my grandparents. And I think that moving here would just give them better opportunities in terms of jobs and for their children too.
And your parents?
My parents, my dad specifically. And
what does
that's
that
my
do?
dad's. My dad, back when he was in the Philippines, he was just doing different types of jobs. Actually, he went to Saudi Arabia at one point, working there. Like I said, it gave more opportunity, better pay.
What did he do in Saudi Arabia?
He was working in maintenance. My dad never finished college. Yeah, he worked in maintenance in Saudi Arabia.
Did your dad ever talk to you about what it was like working in Saudi?
From time to time, but we don't talk about it that often. Things like it was hard that the job that he had there was hard. And it was tough for my mom. I know that because back then it was hard to communicate. Not like now we have internet and phone. Back then, I still remember recording our messages to my dad in a tape recorder, and we would send that via mail. It would be like our voice message to my dad.
I brought it up because when I lived in Saudi, I remember getting a ride I took taxis a lot there, and the taxi driver was from the Philippines. And I had a conversation about his hours and his days off. And he worked 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. There was no day off. He laughed when I asked about a day off. Mm-hmm. And lived in, basically it was 6 people to 1 room. Mm-hmm. So he was living 6 people to 1 room and working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and sending all of his money back to the Philippines. Mm-hmm. I just think it's a sacrifice that most of us can't even imagine.
And I would say that the same kind of life experience are felt by those Filipinos working in fish processing plants. 4 or 5 or 6 of them in a room, in their door. And they have crazy work schedule, sometimes 12-hour shifts, 10-hour shifts.
They're doing like repeated motion type.
Repeated motion, repeated filleting. Sometimes working with crabs, all of those things.
With a conveyor belt, it never stops.
That's right. It never stops. And I had the opportunity to actually tour the fish processing plant, and just how much is involved in that work is, to me, unfathomable. I've never seen it I've never seen it before. And when I saw it, I got to appreciate how much work is done in processing fish. When now when I eat imitation crab, I think about how many Filipino hands was on that to make that thing that we like to eat with our sushi, right? And so it gives me a much better appreciation of all of those things and how much work is involved. Because of those conditions, they are prone to injuries. I've heard stories about fingers being cut off or having back problems, or even just respiratory problems just because of constant work.
How often do you visit the Philippines?
The last time we visited was last summer. My parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary there. So that was fun. But typically we visit the Philippines every other year when the opportunity presents itself.
And what part of the Philippines are you from?
I was born and raised in Makati, which is in Metro Manila. And that's the place where I go to when we go to the Philippines. My wife's side of the family, she is from the Quezon province, which is just about 3 hours south of Metro Manila.
You met your wife here in Alaska?
I met my wife in the Philippines while I was doing my dissertation research in their community.
That's interesting. So how did that happen?
It's a funny story because I just completed my last set of interview for my research study. And just right after I did my interview, I was coming out of the house and there I met my wife. It was funny because the mayor there of Lucena City, which is the capital city of Quezon, I was in touch with the mayor there when I did my dissertation to seek for permission to do all of my research work there. And the mayor told me, young man, you will find your spouse here in our city. Little did I know I did find my wife there in his city.
Was she excited to move to Alaska?
I think she was excited to be with me. Being in Alaska is something very unusual or very exotic to her. She doesn't know what to expect. Just like when I was a little kid, I didn't know what to expect of Alaska. When my family told me we're going to move to Alaska, I didn't know what to expect. I thought there's going to be a lot of snow, there's going to be igloos, and all of those things. That was the kind of perception that I have of Alaska. And my wife, I would assume, had the same kind of perception as well.
She likes it, though? Are you guys content to stay here?
We are content staying here. My wife started to like the Alaska way of life. She began to appreciate what Alaska has to offer, the outdoors, the winter kinds of activities. But in the beginning, no. During the winter time, it was cold, and she didn't like the cold. I didn't like the cold when I first experienced the brutal winter weather. But although I would say that the first time I experienced snow, I was very excited about it. I was lucky enough that when my family migrated here, it was still summer. So I enjoyed the fact that the sun never went down and I had a lot more playtime outside. My wife, however, came here in the dead of winter in January.
Well, the good thing about that is that it gets better and better.
That's right. Yeah.
So back to the topic of Filipino American History Month. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the Filipino community in Anchorage?
Yeah, the Filipino community in Anchorage is a vibrant community, and most of the Filipinos live here in Anchorage, in our state. When we first moved here, we really didn't know a lot of how to access resources. I know my mom was struggling a lot, and so was my dad. We didn't know where to find resources, but we didn't have much during that time. We lived with my grandparents when we first migrated here. They were like 3 families working in a 4-bedroom house. So all our family my immediate family was living in one room. Another family was living in another room. There were a lot of us in that house. And when my parents had a little bit more money, we were able to move out of the house and have our own apartment. So it was a challenging time during those times.
Did your dad continue to work in maintenance here, or?
No, my mom finished college, and she was a teacher in the Philippines for about 20 years. When we moved here, she couldn't get a job as a teacher. She ended up working at a fast food restaurant, and so was my dad. So they were working there at a fast food restaurant. My mom moved her way up. She was able to, after working at a local fast food restaurant, she got a job in daycare, take care of kids. And then finally, she was able to find a job with the Anchorage School District. She was an ESL tutor, and she worked there for more than 30 years.
Wow. Do you think Anchorage is a welcoming community to Filipinos?
I think for the most part, Anchorage is a welcoming community. I felt welcome when I came here back in the late 80s, and my wife feels that she's welcomed here. Generally, I would say, yeah, Anchorage is a welcoming community, specifically for Filipinos and other immigrant populations.
So your research is about how folks who experience discrimination can be more resilient.
So the current research that I'm doing now is actually pretty controversial kind of research. I'm looking at ways on how people of color can be more resilient in the face of racism and discrimination. And what I'm looking at are how our programs like ethnic studies or critical race theory, are those programs helpful in terms of being a protective factor from the detrimental mental health effects of racism and discrimination for Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Alternatively, do these kinds of efforts, ethnic studies, critical race theory, DI trainings, are they helpful in terms of helping the white people to be allies of those people of color, but also to be more aware of white privilege and white supremacy? So that's the kind of research questions that I'm looking at in my current research. And we just completed our data collection, so I am excited to start doing the analysis, because these are important topics, not just in Alaska, but all over the U.S.
Are you able to make any recommendations based on just looking at the data so far?
I haven't looked at the data so far, but I can tell you the motivation of why I did that research. And the motivation is that I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a college where I got to learn about Filipino American history, where I got to learn about ethnic studies. That's where I got exposed. And on the other hand, we're seeing nowadays where ethnic studies are being defunded, or critical race theory being cut, books being banned, and history being sanitized. While we try to work hard to prevent that from happening, it's happening now. And so I'm hoping that the data from my research can help provide empirical evidence about the importance of these things.
So it sounds like that the presence of these programs is a protective factor. You can't say with certainty yet.
That is my hypothesis.
Yes. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Does the University of Alaska teach Filipino history?
They don't. But we do have Alaska Native Studies. We do have an ethnic studies here at UAA. We have Alaska Native Studies. It would be nice to incorporate Filipino American history and other histories that are part of the grand American history. Because when I was learning history back in high school and even middle school, I never learned anything about Filipino Americans and their contribution in the history. And not just Filipino Americans, but other minoritized population. I didn't know about their history. But by learning about Filipino American history, I was able to appreciate and that there are other minoritized population who were not included in the history. And so you become more critical of the kinds of history that are being taught in schools. So my hope is that with the passing of the Filipino American history, celebrating Filipino American history in our state, is that we can incorporate Filipino American history in our curriculum.
Dr. Gabe Garcia, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now for our second guest. Our second guest is Dr. EJR David, who is a professor of psychology at UAA. His primary duties being with the PhD program in clinical community psychology that has a rural, cultural, and indigenous emphasis. He has published 4 books. The first 3 are academic works about internalized oppression and the colonial mentality. His 4th is a memoir titled We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet: Letters to My Filipino Athabaskan Family. Dr. EJR David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your childhood was like?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Philippines. I was born in the Philippines. I grew up there. So my first 14 years of life was spent in the Philippines. I was told by Genevieve Mina that you also interviewed Gabe Garcia. And it's really a funny story because we did not know this, but Gabe and I actually went to the same school in the Philippines, not knowing it until we met here many years later. So anyway, I grew up in the Philippines. And when I was 14 years old, that's when my parents decided to send me to Barrow, Alaska, or Utqiagvik, Alaska. And for me, that was a huge change, not just in terms of climate, which is what most people notice right away. But for me, it was more the culture change. So I went from tropic island place to really right there by the Arctic Ocean. And also, I grew up in huge cities, right? I grew up in Metro Manila, millions and millions of people, crowded all the time, concrete everywhere, and then moved to Barrow, Alaska, right? Which is a very different environment. Yeah, just culturally too. And when I moved to Barrow, Alaska, I saw a very different way of living, a very different language, different cultures, different perspectives on life. And really that opened up my eyes in a lot of different ways. And I enjoyed Barrow. I actually consider Utqiagvik as my Alaskan home. I'm still very well connected to that place. Still have family and friends over there to this day. So I grew up there, went to high school there. And then after that, I went to UAA, got my undergraduate degree from UAA, and then had to leave the state because at that time we did not have a doctoral program in psychology here in Alaska at that time. And so really I had no choice but to leave the state to get my degree somewhere else. So I went to Illinois. And then after that,
I want to stop you really fast. So you said your parents sent you to Utqiagvik.
Yeah.
So they stayed in Manila?
Yeah. So my parents got divorced when I was around 10 years old. My father was the one who moved to Utqiagvik first. So my father was the one who left the Philippines and moved to the United States first. And
why did he go there?
Like many people, jobs. So he actually went to California first, tried to get a good job in California. I went to New York because that's where family was. We had siblings. My uncles and my aunts were in California and New York. Tried it out there. And then eventually one of his brothers and one of his cousins this is in the early 80s, when there were a lot of jobs available up in the North Slope because of the oil industry. And it's not necessarily oil jobs, but because of the oil industry, it opened up a lot of different jobs. And so they told him and said, hey, there are a lot of jobs here. Come over here. They pay well. And so that's when he moved to Alaska in 1985, I believe. And
what did your dad do?
A lot of random things. So again, he did not come because of oil or a specific skill that he has. It's because of those jobs that opened up. So initially he went there and worked in the post office, sorting mail. And then he also found a job driving cabs and working at Arctic Pizza on the side. And then eventually he found one of his more stable jobs. He ended up working for the borough, the North Slope Borough. He drove around those sanitation trucks, those trucks that collect the honey buckets. This is way back in the days before everybody had flush toilets, right? And so he did that job. He was collecting honey buckets from people's houses. Yeah.
So what year did you arrive?
1994.
Oh, okay. So your dad had been there for a while.
Yeah, about 9-10 years. He'd been there a while. So that's when he was finally able to become a United States citizen. And that's when he was able to come get me and my brother. I was 14. My brother was about to turn 8. I believe he was like 7.5. when we moved to Alaska. Yeah.
So I interrupted you. You were talking about having to go
Yeah,
to
yeah, but
Illinois.
I was just
Yeah.
saying I had to go to Illinois to get my graduate degree, and then around the time that I was finishing up that degree, they started this program here at UAA, and they needed faculty, and so they encouraged me to apply. I did, and I'm very lucky to have that opportunity to come home because Alaska is home. Yeah, and I've been here since.
And your PhD is in psychology.
Yes.
Did you always know you wanted to be a psychologist?
No, not at all. My dream, and to be honest with you, there's still part of me to this day that still is holding on to this dream. I've always wanted to be a professional basketball player. As far-fetched as that may have always been, I really believe that I had a chance. And I did. I mean, I enjoyed basketball. Was my first love. I played basketball for the Whalers. I was really, I was pretty successful. I was all-state a couple of years in high school, but it's just different plans. I'm not tall. I'm not the most athletic person in the world. So it was actually psychology started when I was a freshman at UAA. When I was a freshman at UAA, I was actually a fine arts major because I've always been good at drawing and I had no idea what I wanted to do in college. And I did not know that there was such a thing as a science for understanding people's behaviors and feelings and thoughts until I got to UAA and I had to take this introductory to psychology course. I never saw myself as a scientist, but when I took that psychology course, it began giving me some answers to many questions that I've had about myself and about my loved ones, right? And so that's really when I started falling in love with psychology, was to understand myself and my family and my community better. Yeah.
So I imagine that there was a culture shock when you moved from the Philippines to Utqiagvik when you were 14.
Yeah.
But there would be another culture shock when you moved to Anchorage for undergrad. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Moving to Anchorage from Utqiagvik was an adjustment, right? Utqiagvik is a town of about 4,500 people, mostly Inupiaq folks, right? It's just a very different life there. And then transitioning into Anchorage, where it's a much bigger city, right? And the composition of the city is very different than the composition of Utqiagvik. UAA itself, right? UAA itself, the number of students at UAA is much larger than the whole population of Utqiagvik. And so that was difficult for me. I was, even though prior to Utqiagvik, I lived in a huge city, this was a very different experience for me, nevertheless, because I was alone, right? My parents were not with me. I was becoming an adult. And so I was very lucky that I had a really very supportive circle of people at UAA.
Well, the reason why I'm interviewing you is for Filipino American History Month.
Mhm.
And how much do you know about Filipinos in Alaska in particular and their contributions and the way they fit into Alaska?
Yeah, I'm glad that you're doing this because not a lot of people know that Filipinos have such a long history in Alaska, right? So oftentimes when people think about Filipinos in the United States, they might think of like Hawaii, or they might think of California, where there are large concentrations of Filipinos, right? But I think Alaska should be in that same conversation as Hawaii and California, right? For really three reasons. One, because of the long history of Filipinos in this state, just like in California and Hawaii. There's like long history here. It goes back to about 1788, actually. And Thelma Buckholt, who I'm sure you know of her, she did this
the
research.
first Filipino legislator.
Yes.
In Alaska, in the Alaska legislature, yes.
Anyway, she did this research. So it goes back to 1788. But then the early 1900s was when larger numbers of Filipinos started settling here in Alaska as they worked in the fish canneries. So again, long history. So that's reason one. Number two, large numbers. So just like Hawaii and California, right? There's a large number of Filipinos here in Alaska and the whole state. And then if you focus specifically on some communities, large proportions. Like if you look at Kodiak, you look at Ketchikan, you look at Juneau, you look at Unalaska.
Dutch Harbor.
Yeah. So huge percentage of Filipinos in those communities, right? So long history, large presence. And then also the third is, I think, contributions. We mentioned, Thelma Buckhold and her contributions to the state. But even today, we don't need to be famous or popular to be contributing significantly in the state, right? So there's like a lot of different Filipinos in various industries today, right, that make significant contributions to the state. And so to me, Filipino Alaskan history, right, is Alaskan history. That's just plain and simple. And so I think that's why it's really important. And I'm glad Genevieve led that effort for the state to officially recognize that.
Something that I think a lot about, and you could probably comment on, I worked in Saudi Arabia probably about, I guess, 18 years ago. And I noticed that there were a lot of Filipinos living in Saudi Arabia. I would say every nurse that I met was Filipino. Lots of Filipino taxi drivers, lots of Filipino office workers. And it just seems like there's such a large out migration from the Philippines to everywhere for economic opportunities. It almost feels like there's just like this endless supply of people leaving and no one going back. I might not see it correctly, though. So I don't know if you could just talk about how there's this historic out-migration, but it seems to be a present-day out-migration.
And that's an excellent observation. That is definitely not something that you're making up in your mind. That is definitely true, and that's been happening for a long time, as you noted. It's actually, without going to the specifics too much, it actually started during the Marcos era, Ferdinand Marcos era when he was president. That's one of the things that he emphasized, was that the Filipino talent, right? And he essentially marketed the Filipino talent, the Filipino people, to the rest of the world, right? And beginning during his presidency, that's when we started seeing Filipino people as becoming the country, meaning the Philippines, largest export. So oftentimes when we think about countries and what they're exporting to the rest of the world, we think about their natural resources, right? Whether that be oil or rice or whatever fruit or vegetable or other minerals that they find in their area. In this case, the people became the Philippines' largest export, right? To fill the needs of really other countries. So you talk about nurses, right? That actually started even before the Marcos era. That started like during American colonialism of the Philippines. So that has a long history, right? But yeah, that's true. And the concern there, I think one of the bigger issues that has created is a strong desire. It's now an intergenerational desire, right? To leave the country and to go somewhere else. And so then what that creates is what's left in the Philippines, right? If everybody develops this dream, right? And their dream is to leave the country to go somewhere else, and that's been passed on from generation to generation, that creates like this sense of inferiority toward one's country, right? Toward one's roots, right? So yeah, it's actually, that's what I study, is what is that colonial mentality there that is so ingrained, and how do we break it? So,
right, because your first book was Brown Skin, White Minds, Filipino American Post-Colonial Psychology.
Yep.
And then,
Yeah, because oftentimes people have been talking about the economic consequences of that, which is important, right? And so if you think about the Philippines economically, even though it's no longer technically a colony, and it hasn't been for a long time, right? The systems are still set up in such a colonial way where it's still benefiting other countries, right? Economically. So we educate our people so that our people can leave and go somewhere else in the country, somewhere else in the world. So,
well, I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this in a non-offensive way. Obviously, you are a PhD. But I think that my experience in Saudi Arabia, and my experience to some extent even in Alaska today, is that many Filipinos take jobs that other people will not take. The fish processing plants are dominated, and it's repetitive labor, it's long hours, it's difficult, it's dangerous. It is not something that many folks dream of their children growing up to do.
Yep.
And even rural teachers in Alaska now, like we're importing them from the Philippines. Because why? Because we can't get folks in America to move to rural villages to teach. And so we're importing them from another country. But I think there's probably some tying into like looking at the psychology of why do they take these jobs that no one else wants.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And part of that, a big part of that is because there are limited opportunities in the Philippines. Because again, we train people so they can leave and take jobs anywhere. There's no jobs there available for people, or if there are jobs there, it doesn't pay as much as other countries. But there are also other factors there to consider too, right? Like, sure, there's this pull, it's called pull factors. There are these factors in other countries that are pulling Filipinos from the Philippines. Oh, we need more nurses, or in this case, we need people to do these jobs that nobody else would do. Right. So there are these pull factors, but then there are also these push factors. Like, what's pushing people away from the Philippines? So it's the lack of opportunities. And also, you also have to think about, okay, fine, if there are pull factors, if we need to go to other countries to find people that can fill these jobs, why is it Filipinos? You know, and so then there are those factors to consider. Well, it's because Filipinos have high levels of English proficiency. And also, like when it comes to nurses and teachers, because they're familiar with, one, the teachers are familiar with the American educational system. And then two, the nurses are trained in the American medical system, right? So they're familiar with that too, right? And so the next question is why? Right? So why do Filipinos have high levels of English proficiency, and why are they trained in a very Western way in the Philippines? So you really got to go back to colonialism. This is because of colonialism. That's what it is. That's, earlier when I said the systems are still set up, even though it's not a colony anymore, the institutions and the systems are still set up to operate in a colonial way. It's still, you train people in a Western way so that they can go and serve other countries, mostly Western countries, Canada, the United States, and so on.
So you mentioned Ferdinand Marcos and his promoting of Filipino talent to the world.
Mm-hmm.
Again, from a very American-centric view, I would think that Corazon Aquino becomes president, that there's this much more, what looks like going to be like this democratic revolution, a move towards more democracy, towards maybe a more justice-oriented government. I don't know, something like that. Like, again, but then when we get to Duterte, at least from my Americentric view, this is a bad thing to happen. This is and so I could think that there almost be like political pressure to leave the country, but I could be totally wrong. I don't know. And then I guess Marcos is back in power with his son.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you could talk a little bit about, is there political pressure? Do people leave because they don't like the politics of the Philippines?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do, but people never really leave. So here's the thing. So even with Ferdinand Marcos's plan to export people to the rest of the country,
how did that help him?
Yeah, that's what I was getting to, right?
Okay.
Like, how does that help him? How does that help the Philippines, right? Well, the way that helps the Philippines, because then all those folks that go to other countries to work, Saudi Arabia, for example, a lot of Filipinos go to Saudi Arabia, high-paying jobs, right? What they do is they send money back home. So these quote unquote overseas Filipino workers, or OFWs, right? They're actually one of the, I believe, I don't quote me on this, but they're either the top or the second, but definitely one of the top sources of income for the country. So the money that overseas Filipino workers send back to the Philippines.
That makes total sense.
And so I don't think a lot of people realize that. Like even me, like when I was here and I was a kid, right? When I moved here, I was a kid. I was 14. And then I was in high school. Yes, I would take an after school job. I would take summer jobs. That's not my money. A lot of that money I sent back home. A lot of people don't know this. When I was in high school and when I was in college, I was paying for my niece's school tuition while she was going to school and college. I was paying for her college. So by the time I was in grad school, I was paying for my niece's college education, right? And also sending money to my mom to help with the bills and everything. And I wasn't even like a full-time worker. I was a student, right? But yeah, many Filipinos who are like full-time workers, they leave their families in the Philippines to work somewhere else. The majority of the money that they make, it gets sent back home. And so that's what I mean. Like, we never really leave. We like physically we leave. Many Filipinos are still very much connected to the Philippines to this day. Like even for me, like it's been, what is now, 94? So that's what I'm going on 30 years now, right? here in the United States, but I'm still there. I still send money to my sister and to my nieces, right? My brother, who immigrated with me back in 1994 when he was 7.5, right? He's now the one paying for my other nieces' education in the Philippines. So we're still there. We're still very much connected.
So your second book, Internalized Oppression, The Psychology of Marginalized Groups,
Mm-hmm.
I guess there's a theme in the research that you do. Can you talk about the applications of your research specifically to Filipinos in Alaska?
Yeah. Well, my research is not necessarily Filipino Alaskan specific, right? So when I look at this phenomenon called colonial mentality, or more generally internalized oppression,
And can you
you
flesh
know,
it out? Can you flesh out like what the colonial mentality
yeah, yeah,
is?
yeah. Just very briefly, colonial mentality among Filipinos is this, again, sense of inferiority about their ethnicity, their culture, and everything that falls under that, like their language, thinking that it's not as good as other cultures, specifically, like in this case, the English language. So the English language has been associated with intelligence or higher status, right? And then that also applies then to physical traits. Brown, darker skin has been associated with being poor or being not as attractive, right? Whereas lighter skin has been associated with being more attractive or having a higher status in society. So essentially, everything that is American is seen as superior, and anything that is Filipino is seen as inferior. So that is colonial mentality, right? And that's common not just among Filipinos, but other people with colonized histories, right? And so my research started with Filipinos, but it has expanded. So now me and my collaborators have looked at this among Puerto Ricans who also have a similar history, colonial history. We're currently looking at it right now with Chamorro people of Guam, who is still a colony of the United States to this day, right? So we're seeing this phenomenon play out similarly across different groups. Now, internalized oppression is similar to colonial mentality, but it's a more general term. And this now applies to people, even people without colonial histories, but a history of oppression more generally, right? And for example, women, right? So that's internalized sexism. And so when women internalize the sexism that they've experienced, they might see themselves as not being as smart as men, or not being as strong as men, and so on,
Not
right?
deserving of equal pay.
Exactly, right? Or there are certain jobs or careers that they're not going to be as good at. And then same thing with the LGBTQ community. So people have called that like internalized heterosexism, or, internalized homophobia. So it's the oppression that really is outside of us, right? That permeates the society. If we succumb to them, if we come to believe them, right? And start seeing ourselves in such an inferiorizing way. So that's what internalized oppression is. And so my work, even though again, it started with a very specific community, the Filipino community, I've realized over the years that this is applicable really to a lot of different people. And to be honest with you, the majority of the people of the world.
Your wife is Koyakona Athabaskan?
Oh, yeah, yeah. She's Koyukon Athabaskan from Tlaologa, or Ruby, by the Yukon River. Yeah. So, yeah, and I call my children Philibaskans.
Philabaskans. And was that an easy marriage culturally, or was was there any pushback from either family about this sort of cross-cultural relationship?
No, to be honest with you, we met in Barrow. So we've known each other for a very long time, since 8th grade. And so her family has known me too for a very long time. They've known me as a child, as a teenager. So I think that I think they like me, and that was not a problem to begin with.
It seems like with having children who are Philibaskan, you said?
Yeah.
But growing up in Alaska, that they're going to be prejudiced towards Alaska, that they're going to feel that they are Alaska natives because they live in Alaska.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Do you take them back to the Philippines, and do they have a connection with their Filipino culture? And do you worry about them being more connected to their Alaska native heritage than to their Filipino heritage?
No. So that's one of the things that my wife and I think we're doing a pretty good job of, is we balance that out pretty well. And so I'm supportive of, like, for example, we just finished Elders and Youth and AFN and all the activities that come along with that. And my family was there as much as we could. We were there. We took our kids out of school. My kids didn't go to school during those days. They attended Elders and Youth. And that's, my wife emphasized it. And my kids were like, Dad, what about you? And I'm like, yeah, I want you guys to go. Yeah, hell yeah. We're all going to go. And I'm there too. And then whenever we have events like it's Filipino American History Month right now in October, there's several events. So my wife, like, we're going to the one at the museum at the end of this month, right? So the kids can learn about it. No. So as much as we can, we try to involve the kids and attend as many Alaska Native and Filipino gatherings as much as possible. Of course, we would like to do more. I would love for my kids to get involved in some Filipino traditional dance groups, for example. And there are, like, Gabe's kids are doing that. I would love for my kids to do that too. Sometimes it's not the desire, it's like the time, right? Mm-hmm. But no, my kids, I'm comfortable with where my kids are in terms of their connection to the Filipino culture. And yeah, and they've been to the Philippines a couple of times, actually. It's expensive now, though. If we go, there's like 6 of us. That's, that's at least $12,000 just for plane tickets.
Is there any last thoughts that you'd like to send out to folks about Filipino American History Month? Just things that you want people to be aware of or know more about or think about?
Let's see. I think for Filipino Alaskans specifically, I think it's important for Alaskans to know the long history of Filipinos in the state, the large presence of Filipinos in the state today, right? And the significant contributions of Filipinos to the state in various sectors, in various industries. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important for Alaskans, all Alaskans, to know that, because Filipino Alaskan history is Alaskan history.
Thank you so much. And let's recommend your book. Your last book was We Have Not Stopped Trembling Yet. What year did that come out?
That one came out in 2019. Yeah.
And that was the less academic book. So it sounds like one that our listeners would want to read.
I hope so. It's not light reading. It is heavy. It's about heavy topic. It was sparked by the death of my best friend in Utqiagvik, Pamiak Nagyak. He was shot and killed by a police officer in his own home. So that was actually the spark for that book. And after that happened, I, started thinking about myself, started thinking about my family, and then going to the history and how that's not an isolated incident, and it's not even a modern incident, and how it has very long roots in our history as people. So,
well, it sounds like an important book, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks, Andrew.
I'm now going to play the speech that Representative Genevieve Mina gave on the floor of the Alaska House on March 31st, 2023. Just prior to our vote on her bill, which made October officially Filipino American History Month.
History Month. Representative Mina.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be presenting House Bill 23, which is to officially recognize October as Filipino American History Month in state statute. History is important. I'm a big lover of history, Alaska history, political history, all of it. But growing up, I really didn't know too much about Filipino American history. In Filipino culture, there's this saying from the Filipino national hero, Jose Rizal, which is, to know history is to know self, know history, know self. Filipinos in Alaska have had a substantial impact in this state. We're the largest Asian American Pacific Islander group. We're the largest immigrant group. We've made long contributions in terms of being cannery workers, in our healthcare and workforce, in labor advocacy. Filipinos in Alaska have this complexity in the Alaska history itself. However, this history is not often reflective. And I just want to name a couple of different national contributions and state contributions, if I so may. Nationally, Filipinos were the first Asian group recorded to set foot in America, recorded on October 18, 1587. And Filipinos have made a substantial impact to the United States of America through our military, through labor organizing, through our economy, religious groups, community groups. 3 examples I'd like to highlight here. In World War II, 250,000 Filipino soldiers served under the command of General Douglas MacArthur in the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, becoming recognized as U.S. nationals, but not being afforded the same rights, privileges, and pensions as U.S. citizens. And many of these benefits weren't officially recognized by Congress until the past decade. I learned recently that my grandfather was one of these guerrilla fighters during World War II. In the 60s, there was a very significant worldwide grape strike, the Delano grape strike. It was started by Filipino farm workers. So a lot of people know the name of Cesar Chavez, but not many people know the labor union organizer, Larry Itliong, that convinced those Latino farm workers to join together and start that grape strike. Afterwards, a couple of decades later, my father became also one of those farm workers working on those grape farms and coming up to Alaska to work in canneries. And then in the 50s, America faced a big nursing shortage after World War II, and the 1965 Immigration Act resulted in a significant increase of Filipino nurses moving to America, where now 1/3 of foreign-born nurses here are from the Philippines. My mom is one of these nurses. It's incredible to live this life and not really understand the full history of where your family comes from and how your own history, being an immigrant and a daughter of immigrants, relates to the American history that is so intertwined in who we are as Americans. And in Alaska, we have this really rich history where Filipino Americans were first recorded in Alaska in 1788 as seamen on Spaniard ships. In the North Slope, we've seen that there have been a lot of Filipino crew members on whaling ships. And also in the Southeast, due to racial discrimination, there's a long history of Filipinos marrying with Tlingit families, Haida and Upiat women on the North, in the Arctic, building blended mestizo families where there's a long history of them today. These are long-established communities, and this history was first recognized nationally through the Filipino American National Historical Society, where in 1992, they celebrated the very first ever Filipino American History Month. It's the month of October because that is the month where Filipinos were first recorded on these lands in America, but also it's the birth month of Larry Itliong. Another thing that is significant to me especially is that the first Filipina elected to this Alaska State Legislature, Thelma Buckled, was also a significant member in the Filipino American National Historical Society. One of the pieces of testimony that really stuck out to me in the State Affairs Committee that I would just like to echo was from Dr. Gabriel Garcia, who's a university professor at UAA. And he said that this bill has a zero fiscal note, but it's priceless to Filipino Americans in this state. And so I am excited to present this bill, and I hope that I encourage the support of fellow members in this body. Thank you.
Thank you to our guests, Dr. Gabriel Garcia and Dr. EJ David. And big thanks to Representative Genevieve Mina for helping me put this episode together. And thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's East Anchorage Book Club, all one word, @gmail.com.